We've talked a lot about the Youth Empowerment Conceptual Framework. What we need to remember is that youth-led programming in Ohio is based upon two frameworks, the Youth Empowerment Conceptual Framework and the Strategic Prevention Framework. The purpose of this section is to draw our attention to how we as adult allies are going to engage young people in the Strategic Prevention Framework, specifically the assessment and the planning phases of the SPIF. As adult allies, we need to think about how we're going to break down the very essence of the assessment and planning phases of the SPIF and make that palatable and understandable to the young people that we work with. If we really think about boiling down the assessment and planning phases, we get to three key components. One is identifying an issue of focus. The second is identifying the intervening variables, those contributing factors, which influence the issue of focus. And three, of course, the fun part, selecting strategies that we are going to implement in order to make community-level change. The first step in our process is to determine an issue of focus. And within that, there are three key components. One is identifying a statement of need. Two, who does that problem or issue impact? And three, where is that problem or issue occurring in our community? As adult allies, we have to carefully consider our role in assisting young people in selecting that issue of focus. This focus has to be data-driven, but where we start may or may not be with data. We look at the SPIF as being a data-driven process, but data sometimes doesn't resonate with young people right away. And so when we think of the SPIF, we know that that data is really important, but we have to decide when that data comes in. And so in a process like this, it's just first, let's just think with our heads and our hearts, and then where do we, as adult allies, bring and pull the data in later? We have to think critically about the types of data that we're using with young people. Sometimes our adult standards of data, we hear epidemiological quality data, we hear things like statistical power, we hear things like representativeness, reliability, validity. Those are all very important with data. But we may not need that quality of data to work in the space of youth-led programming. And then you also have to think about the cognitive, social, and emotional development. So if you have a middle school group, it's going to look very different than a high school group. It's going to look very different from what we do here with our young adults who are in the college setting, right? And so we have to decide what data is appropriate at each age level. So our next problem at hand is that we have to identify these intervening variables as levers for change. They need to determine why that issue of focus is impacting their community. So we may need to collect more data, or we may need to look more deeply at the data that we've already collected in order to help us understand those very important questions. Why here? Why now? So our intervening variables, or sometimes CAD calls them contributing factors. Sometimes we hear them called the why here, why now. Sometimes they're just really levers. If our issue is underage drinking, we can't just wave a magic wand and fix underage drinking. We have to figure out why here, why now. What are some levers that I can pull in order to make that community change? And then finally, once we know what the levers are, we actually have to pick that strategy. Right? And we have to pick that as a group, and it may be one strategy or two strategies, or however many you have time to do, but it has to be evidence-based. It's important to remember that our strategies are explicitly linked to our intervening variables or our levers. It's that link that provides our overall theory of change. If we go back to our example of underage drinking, we've developed a series of if-then statements. So let's say that we've identified underage drinking as being an issue in our community, and the intervening variable is that we have retail outlets who are selling to minors. So let's say the strategy that we have chosen is server-seller training. So what we can say is that if we implement server-seller training, then retail outlets will become more knowledgeable to the current laws. If retail outlets are more knowledgeable to the current laws regarding underage drinking, then they will be less likely to sell to minors. If retail outlets are less likely to sell to minors, then minors will be less likely to acquire alcohol through retail outlets. If minors are less likely to acquire alcohol through retail outlets, then they will be less likely to consume alcohol. And it's that theory of change that brings our process full circle. So it's important to remember those if-then statements, and sometimes it helps just to think through the if-then statements in great detail, because that is how students understand the link between their strategy and the change that they want to have within their community. Well, hopefully today's really given you a new lens to think about what we do with our young people. They may never ever see the Holden model, they may never ever see the Spiff flower, and that's not necessarily important. What it is we are creating opportunities for young people to become change agents, and that's what youth empowerment is.